There's a kind of silence that only exists in war. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet morning. This is the silence that comes after the last radio transmission cuts out. After the last man's voice breaks mid-sentence. After a team of the most trained soldiers on Earth whispers 3 words into a dead frequency. We are trapped, and nobody answers back. That silence was sitting on 8 Army Rangers like a boot on a throat. They were pinned. 8 enemy snipers had locked down every exit point from the ridge. 4 men were already down, not dead, but bleeding in ways that meant the clock was running. The others had burned through 2/3 of their ammunition trying to figure out where the fire was even coming from. Every time someone lifted their head, a round hit something 2 inches from it. The enemy knew exactly where they were. The enemy had been watching them for a long time before the first shot was ever fired. The Rangers called it in. Command heard the transmission. Command started making calculations. Extraction time, air support windows, available units in range. Those calculations were going to take 18 minutes. In 18 minutes, 4 wounded men could become 8 dead ones. Nobody was supposed to be close enough to help. Nobody except her. Her name was Sergeant Lee and Hester. She was 23 years old. She was a military police officer, not a ranger, not special forces, not one of combat armed soldiers who trained their whole lives for moments exactly like this one. She was driving a convoy security route in Iraq. Routine patrol, the kind of mission that gets written in logs and forgotten by morning. She heard the call on the radio. What happened next? What she did, alone, on foot, in a kill zone that had already swallowed 8 trained snipers' full attention, would make her the first woman since World War II to be awarded the Silver Star for direct combat action. It would be studied in military training programs. It would be argued about by people who were not there. But arguments happen in safe rooms. What happened on that road happened in the dirt, in the noise, in the kind of moment where the difference between thinking and dying is measured in fractions of a second. This is that story. All of it. The parts that made it into the news and the parts that didn't. The girl from Bowling Green, Kentucky, who grew up too fast, signed a contract the day she turned old enough to sign one, and ended up standing in a trench in Iraq with a rifle, 8 snipers, and a choice that most people will never be asked to make. She made it without blinking. You need to understand how she got there before you can understand what she did. Because nothing that happened on that road was an accident. Every single second of it, the terror, the instinct, the movement, the shots, was built from years of a life that most people would have quit halfway through. She didn't quit anything. That's where the story starts. Bowling Green, Kentucky, is the kind of town that teaches you early that the world is not going to come looking for you. You go looking for it, or you stay. Most people stay. The town doesn't punish you for staying. It just slowly makes you forget there was ever a question. Lee and Hester was never going to stay. She was born 1982, the second child in a family that didn't have excess of anything except love, and the particular stubbornness that Kentuckians seem to grow like a secondary bone structure. Something underneath the regular skeleton, harder than the rest, invisible until you press on it the wrong way. Her mother worked. Her father worked. There was food on the table and clothes on her back and a roof that didn't leak, and in that town in that time, that was a complete life. A good one even. But Lee and had the thing that either ruins you or saves you depending entirely on what you do with it. She had the inability to sit still when something was wrong. Not in the fidgeting sense, in the moral sense. When she saw something broken, she felt it personally, like it was her furniture, like someone had knocked over something in her own house and walked away, and she was the only one who noticed. That quality made her the kid who broke up fights on the school bus, who told teachers when something wasn't fair, even when it wasn't her grade being affected, who called adults out, politely, carefully, but without backing down, when they said things that didn't add up. She was not aggressive. She was not difficult. She was precise. There's a difference, and the people who knew her understood it. The ones who didn't know her sometimes made the mistake of confusing her steadiness for softness. That was always the last mistake they made with her. She graduated from Franklin Simpson High School in 2001, and she did it the same way she did most things, without fanfare, without ceremony, with a quiet sense of completion and an immediate eye toward what came next. College was one option. Work was another. The military had been a thought in the back of her mind for long enough that it had started to feel less like a thought and more like a direction, like something she had already decided and just hadn't said out loud yet. Then, September 11th happened. She was 19 years old. She watched the towers come down on television like every other American that morning, sitting somewhere between shock and a slow, rising fury that she didn't quite have words for yet. The fury wasn't hot. It wasn't the kind that makes you want to throw things. It was the cold, clarifying kind, the kind that makes everything else fall away until only the most important question is left standing. What are you going to do about it? Lee and Hester was not the type to ask a question and then walk away from the answer. She enlisted in the Army National Guard in 2001, the year the towers fell, the year the country went to war with a grief it didn't know what to do with. She was assigned to the 617th Military Police Company out of Richmond, Kentucky. Military police. Not infantry. Not rangers. Not the sharp end of anything. By the Army's official accounting of what constitutes combat. MP units run convoy security. They process detainees. They enforce order and law inside the military's own systems. They are the institution's internal skeleton, the part that keeps everything upright when chaos moves in sideways. It was not, on paper, the most dangerous assignment in the Army. History would disagree with that paper. She went through basic training the way she went through everything else, without complaint, without drama, with an almost unsettling amount of focus. The drill sergeants who trained her remember, in the accounts that have been preserved, that she was not the loudest or the most physically imposing recruit they'd ever seen. She was 5'4" on a good day. She didn't fill a room when she walked in. What she had instead was the thing that drill instructors, the good ones, the ones who have actually been shot at, and come back to tell new soldiers what it really feels like, spend their whole career trying to teach, and almost never can. She had genuine, unperformed calm. Most people fake calm under stress. They force their breathing. They tell themselves the right things. They perform competence for the people watching. Lee and Hester did not perform calm. She simply was calm, in a way that some people are left-handed or blue-eyed. Not chosen, just native. Her range scores were excellent. Her PT scores climbed steadily. She learned fast and retained everything and asked questions that were better than the questions most of her fellow trainees were asking. Not because she was trying to seem smart, but because she genuinely needed to understand how things worked at the ground level before she could commit to using them. She graduated. She went home to Kentucky. She trained with her unit. She did the regular life of a guard person in the years before deployment became a near certainty for everyone with a uniform. Weekends at the armory, annual training, the slow rhythm of a soldier's life lived mostly in the regular civilian world with one foot always pointed toward something else. She was 20 when the invasion of Iraq began. 21 when it became clear the war was not going to end the way the early briefings suggested. 22 when the 617th Military Police Company received its deployment orders. Iraq, 2004. The insurgency was no longer a fringe phenomenon. It was the dominant reality of the country. IEDs were killing soldiers on roads that had looked safe the day before. Convoy ambushes were a daily occurrence in certain sectors. The enemy had figured out that they could not fight the American military in a straight line, in a direct engagement where American training and American equipment made the outcome a foregone conclusion. So they had stopped fighting in straight lines. They had gone to ground. They had gone to roadsides. They had gone to the patient, invisible, economical violence of men who had nothing to lose and all the time in the world. The 617th deployed into that. Not into a clean war with visible front lines. Into a war that lived in the gaps. In the moment between one radio check and the next. In the dust that followed a truck down a road that had been driven 100 times before and was safe every single one of those times until it wasn't. Sergeant Lee and Hester was 22 years old when she arrived in Iraq. She had been promoted steadily, earned her stripes without drama, and was by that point the kind of soldier that her unit built plans around without entirely realizing they were doing it. She ran convoy security missions. She drove the routes. She learned the roads the way a person learns a recurring dream. The specific places where something felt wrong, the intersections where the air changed, the stretches of highway where the locals made a point of not looking at the convoy as it passed, which was itself a kind of information if you knew how to read it. She was reading everything. She had been in country for several months when March 20th, 2005 arrived. It was not a day that looked different from the outside. The sky was the same. The roads were the same. The convoy, a logistics resupply mission in Salman Pak, southeast of Baghdad, was the same kind of mission she had run before. Staff Sergeant Timothy Neen was the squad leader. Specialist Ashley Pullen was driving. There were other vehicles, other soldiers, other rifles pointed outward in the standard formation that was supposed to make the convoy a hard target. The convoy was the target anyway. The ambush was pre-planned and professionally executed. Approximately 40 insurgents had positioned themselves on both sides of a road using a formation that military analysts would later describe as a classic L-shaped ambush, the kind designed to maximize fire coverage while denying the target any safe direction of retreat. They had RPGs. They had rifles. They had chosen the ground carefully, and they had been patient. 40 men against a convoy of soldiers moving through what was supposed to be a secured route. The first shots hit before anyone had fully processed that shots were being fired. In an ambush, the first seconds are the worst. Not because of the physical danger, though the physical danger is real and immediate and everywhere, but because of what happens to the human brain when the entire world detonates without warning. Training exists specifically for this moment. All of the repetition, all of the drills, all of the muscle memory that soldiers build over years of practice exists to answer one question. When your brain white screens from shock and terror, what does your body do? Lee and Hester's body did the right thing. She was not in the lead vehicle. She was in a support position. When the shooting started, she did the calculation in the time it takes most people to flinch, the position of the fire, the direction of the kill zone, the location of her people. She didn't wait for an order. She moved. She dismounted her vehicle. That detail matters. In an ambush, the instinct, the deep animal instinct that every human being shares, is to get behind something large and solid and stay there. The vehicle is solid. The vehicle is the known thing. Getting out of the vehicle and moving toward the source of incoming fire is not the instinct. It is the opposite of the instinct. It is what training builds over years specifically because no one does it naturally. She did it. The insurgents had prepared for a convoy. They had prepared for vehicles returning fire from behind cover. They had prepared for a static engagement where they could maintain their positions and work through the convoy methodically. They had not prepared for a 5'4" military police sergeant to come off a vehicle and move aggressively through a flanking position toward their trench line. She moved through the kill zone. The ground between her vehicle and the insurgent positions was not protected ground. There was no cover that made it safe. Every step she took was a step that could have been her last, and she knew that. And she went anyway, not because she was fearless, but because there were people on that convoy who needed someone to go. She reached the trench line, the fighting that happened in that trench. Close range, close quarters, the kind of fighting that happens when 2 feet is too far away to call it anything, but hand to hand, lasted approximately 20 minutes from the first shot to the last. She cleared sections of the trench with her rifle. She moved. She fired. She assessed. She moved again. Staff Sergeant Neen was with her through parts of it. Other soldiers contributed. But the accounts, the after-action reports, the statement from the soldiers who were there, the testimony that went into the Silver Star recommendation, are consistent on one point. Lee and Hester was at the front of it. She killed 3 insurgents in that trench. She wounded others. She moved through the position the way her training had built her to move. Not heroically, not cinematically, but functionally, precisely, with the particular economy of motion that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and not wasting a single movement on anything that doesn't serve the purpose directly in front of you. When it was over, 27 insurgents were dead. 6 were captured. The convoy, every member of it was alive. In the immediate aftermath, when the shooting stopped and the silence came back, the different silence, the after-battle silence that feels like the world pressing its ear against the ground. Lee and Hester sat in the dirt trench in Iraq and did what soldiers do when the adrenaline starts draining. She checked her people. She checked her ammunition. She reported. She did not know yet what the army was going to do with what she had done. She did not know about the Silver Star. She did not know about the ceremony that would come months later, or the photographs that would end up in newspapers, or the interviews, or the military historians who would note quietly that she was the first woman since World War II to receive the Silver Star for direct combat action. She knew her people were alive. That, on March 20th, 2005, in a ditch southeast of Baghdad, was the only accounting that mattered to her. The Army's accounting would come later. So would the world's. But first, before the ceremony, before the recognition, before the story became something that got told in training rooms, and written about in books. There's just the road and the dust and the silence after, and a young woman from Bowling Green, Kentucky, sitting in a rocky trench with a rifle across her knees, watching to make sure her people were still breathing. They were. She had made sure of it. The convoy reformed. The vehicles moved. The road that had been a kill zone an hour earlier was just a road again. The way roads always look innocent after the thing that happened on them has already happened. The dust settled. The sun stayed where it was. Iraq continued being Iraq. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a sergeant who wasn't supposed to be in a combat role had just fought one of the most decisive, small unit engagements of the entire Iraq War. And she had done it with the same quality she had brought to every other moment of her life since Bowling Green. She had done it without drama, without fanfare, without blinking. The Army does not move fast when it decides to honor someone. It moves like a large piece of machinery that was designed by a committee and operated by 3 different departments who are not entirely sure what the other 2 departments are doing. There are forms. There are reviews. There are recommendations that go up a chain and come back down slightly altered and go back up again. There are people who weigh words like they are precious metal, and people who sign their names on documents that will outlast them by decades. By the time the Silver Star recommendation for Sergeant Leon Hester had worked its way through the system and come back stamped and approved, 3 months had passed since the ambush at Salman Pak. 3 months during which she had continued doing her job, running convoys, watching roads, coming back alive, and going out again. She did not talk about what she had done, not in the way that gets people noticed. She was not the soldier who replayed the story in the chow hall, getting louder with each telling, adding detail the way you add seasoning to something that needs it. She was the soldier who went back to work. The other members of her unit knew what had happened. Staff Sergeant Nee knew. The soldiers who had been on that convoy knew. But she did not carry the ambush around like an identity. She carried it the way you carry something that belongs to you, but doesn't need to be displayed, quietly, internally, tucked into the part of yourself that you don't show at dinner. The ceremony happened in June of 2005. It was held in Baghdad. General David Petraeus presided. The same Petraeus who would later become one of the most analyzed figures of the entire Iraq and Afghanistan era, whose name would be attached to the counterinsurgency doctrine that the Army built and rebuilt in those years, whose understanding of the war was operational and strategic and political all at once. He stood in front of Lee and Hester and pinned a silver starter uniform, and the photographers took the photographs, and the reporters who were there wrote the sentences that would get picked up and printed in newspapers back home. First woman since World War II. Silver Star. Direct combat action. Those sentences were true. They were also, in a way that headlines are always incomplete, missing most of the actual story. The actual story was not about firsts. The actual story was not about gender or history or the particular glass ceiling that the Army had been quietly pretending wasn't there for decades. The actual story was about what happens inside 20 minutes in a trench when the distance between survival and failure is measured not in strategy or planning, but in the quality of a single human being's nerve. But the world wanted the first woman angle, and the world was not entirely wrong to want it. Because the fact that it was a first, that in the 60 years between World War II and that June ceremony in Baghdad, no woman had received the Silver Star for direct combat. That fact was itself a story about what the military had been doing and not doing with its women for 6 decades. It was a story about the jobs they'd been given, the roles they'd been assigned, the proximity to danger they'd been allowed, and the recognition they'd been afforded when that proximity inevitably collapsed into contact. Lee and Hester did not particularly want to be a symbol. She had not enlisted to prove a point. She had not joined the military police because she thought that was the route to a history-making moment. She had joined because the country went to war, and she was someone who could not sit still when something was wrong. And a war that needed fighting was, by her accounting, something wrong that she could do something about. The ceremony was not her favorite part. She stood straight. She accepted the medal. She answered the reporters' questions with the particular precision she brought to everything, completely, honestly, without embellishment, without false modesty. When they asked her how it felt to be the first woman since World War II to receive the Silver Star for direct combat, she said, without hesitation, that she didn't think about it that way, that she had done what any soldier would have done, that the mission was to protect the convoy, and she had done the mission. The reporters wrote that down. Some of them believed her. Some of them thought she was being modest. Some of them had already decided what the story was before they asked the question, and her answer was useful whether she meant it the way they were going to frame it or not. She meant it exactly the way she said it. The other thing that happened after the ceremony, the thing that didn't make the newspapers, the thing that existed entirely in the internal world of the Army and the people who cared about how the Army worked, was a quiet but significant argument. It was not a new argument. It was, in fact, one of the oldest arguments in the American military, one that had been running in various forms since women first served in any capacity connected to combat. The argument was simple on its face and complex in every other direction. Should women serve in direct combat roles? Lee and Hester had not been in a direct combat role. She had been in a military police role that had, through the particular unpredictability of a guerrilla war with no front lines, become a direct combat role on March 20th, 2005. That gap between her official designation and what she had actually done was not unique to her. Women serving as military police, as intelligence officers, as medical personnel, as convoy drivers, had been in firefights, had taken fire, had returned it, had killed and been wounded and died throughout the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The official policy said they were not in combat roles. The official policy and the ground truth had been diverging for years. Her Silver Star made that divergence impossible to ignore at the policy level, even if the people responsible for policy did their best to look past it. The argument went on for years after the ceremony. It would not be resolved, not officially, not by the Army changing its policies, for another decade. In 2013, the Department of Defense lifted the ban on women in direct combat roles. In 2015, all combat roles were open to women who could meet the standards. The conversation that started with Lee and Hester and women like her, the women who had been doing the job without the title for years, finally reached its institutional conclusion. She was not the only reason that happened. History rarely works on single causes. But she was one of the faces that the argument kept returning to. The photograph from the June ceremony, her standing straight, General Petraeus pinning the medal, the Iraqi son doing what the Iraqi son always did, became one of the images that policy arguments reached for when they needed something concrete to point at. She was not interested in being pointed at. But she was also not interested in pretending the pointing wasn't happening. Back in Iraq, back on the roads, the war continued. The 617th continued its missions. The routes that had ambushed them did not become safer after March 20th. They became, if anything, more complicated as the units responsible for them tried to learn from what had happened, and the insurgent networks tried to adapt. The war was not something that had a learning curve for one side and not the other. Both sides were learning. Both sides were adjusting. The only thing that didn't adjust was the violence, which stayed at the same temperature regardless of what either side figured out. Lee and Hester came home from Iraq. She returned to Kentucky, to the Guard, to the civilian life that runs parallel to the military life for reservists and Guard people in a way that active duty soldiers don't experience. She was 23 years old, and she had a Silver Star and a combat record that would have been remarkable for any soldier and was historically unprecedented for a woman, and she went back to Bowling Green and got on with it. She re-enlisted. She was promoted. She went back to Iraq on a second deployment. She continued doing the work, the actual work, the unglamorous, daily, physical work of being a soldier in a war that the country's attention was slowly drifting away from even as the soldiers who fought it kept going back. The second deployment was different from the first. Not because the war was different, it wasn't, not in any fundamental way, but because she was different. She was older by 2 years, which in war years is something much larger. She had 2 years of survival on her record, 2 years of knowing what the job actually felt like from the inside instead of from the training room. She had the particular authority that comes from having been tested and having passed the test and knowing that about yourself without needing anyone to confirm it. She also had the Silver Star, which changed the way people looked at her in ways she found mostly inconvenient. The soldiers who hadn't been there sometimes treated it like a superpower, like she had some quality that other people didn't have, like what she had done in the trench was the result of something rare and genetic rather than something earned and built and chosen under pressure. She pushed back against that reading every time she encountered it. She was not interested in being exceptional. She was interested in being useful. The soldiers who had been on the convoy with her did not treat her like an exception. They treated her like what she was, which was the person who had been in the trench with them, who had made the choices that kept them alive. That relationship, the relationship between people who have shared something that cannot be fully communicated to anyone who wasn't there, is its own category of human connection. There are no good words for it. Soldiers have been failing to explain it to civilians since the first war was fought. She understood it from the inside now. The second deployment ended. She came home again. The years moved. The war moved with them. Iraq went through its phases. The surge, the drawdown, the fragile stability that everyone who had been paying attention understood was more fragile than it looked, the eventual collapse of certain gains, and the appearance of new threats from the space the war had opened up. She was watching all of it, still in the guard, still doing the work. There were interviews over the years, magazine pieces, the occasional television segment, military history researchers who wanted her account of March 20th for their books and their papers. She gave the accounts without elaboration, with the same precision she had always brought to things that mattered. She was not interested in the mythology. She was interested in the record being accurate. The record was, in fact, accurate. What happened on that road happened the way she said it happened. The after-action reports confirmed it. The other soldiers confirmed it. The physical evidence confirmed it. 27 insurgents killed. 6 captured. Every member of the convoy alive. Those numbers were not disputed by anyone with access to the actual documents. What the record could not capture, what no after-action report has ever been designed to capture, was the interior of those 20 minutes. The specific quality of air in a trench when you're moving through it with a rifle and the person in front of you may or may not still be breathing. The particular arithmetic of a firefight at close range, where the variables are not distance and trajectory, but presence and decision and the simple fact of continuing to move when every primitive instinct in your nervous system is screaming at you to stop. No document captures that. No metal represents it fully. The silver star is a piece of metal on a ribbon. It is a symbol of something that cannot be made symbolic without losing most of what it actually was. She knew this. She wore the medal when protocol required it. She put away when protocol didn't. She went on being a soldier. Not because the army asked her to. Not because the recognition demanded some kind of continuation. But because it was what she was underneath the rank and the uniform and the history-making moment that the world kept wanting to put in a frame. She was a soldier from Kentucky who had seen something that needed to be done and done it, and the doing of it had not changed that fundamental thing about her. The thing that didn't sit still when something was wrong. She still had that. She was always going to have that. No ceremony could give it to her, and no ceremony could take it away. It was hers from before the war started. It would be hers after the last gun went quiet. And the war, for Lee and Hester, was not finished. Not because she hadn't served enough. Not because the army demanded more of her. But because the person who runs toward a trench instead of away from it is not built to sit still when the world is still producing trenches. She knew that about herself. She had always known it. The thing about a story that the world decides is important is that the world keeps telling it whether the person at the center of it wants it told or not. Lee and Hester did not go to Iraq to become a story. She went to Iraq to do a job, and she did the job, and the job on one particular morning in March produced something that the army and the media and the historians and the policy people all needed for different reasons to make into a story. She understood this. She was not naive about how institutions and information worked. She had grown up in a country that ran on narrative the way engines run on combustion. Everything reduced to a story that could be told quickly enough to hold attention. She understood the machinery. She just didn't particularly want to be the fuel. What she wanted in the years after the Silver Star ceremony, after the second deployment, after the interviews and the features and the policy debates that kept attaching her name to themselves, was to be a soldier. A good one. A useful one. The kind of soldier whose value is not in what she represents, but in what she can do and what she does with the people around her. She stayed in. She advanced. She cross-trained. She picked up skills in areas that interested her, and then used those skills to become more capable, and then found new areas that interested her, and picked up those skills too. This is how the best soldiers develop. Not in a straight line toward a single specialty, but in a widening circle, adding capability without losing any of what came before. She was, by the time her career entered its middle years, the kind of soldier that a unit is lucky to have, not because of the medal or the story, but because of the practical, daily, unspectacular quality of her competence. She also, in those middle years, became something else. Something that does not always come with competence, but that is worth more in the long run than competence alone. She became a teacher, not in a classroom, not in the formal sense of a military instructor assigned to a training school, though that role would come too. In the informal sense that happens in every unit where someone has been somewhere and come back, and the younger soldiers know it without being told. The way they ask questions with a certain weight to them, the way they listen differently to the answers, the way they watch how she moves through a situation to get data they can't get from a manual. She taught by example, by showing, not telling, by being, in the daily practice of her job, the answer to the question that every young soldier is really asking, which is not what is the doctrine or what are the rules of engagement, but the deeper one, the one that keeps people up at night in the weeks before deployment. The one that says, when it is real, when it is happening, when there is no more time to prepare, and the only thing left is the moment itself. Who will I be? She was the answer to that question. Walking around, doing her job, being exactly who she was in both the quiet moments and the loud ones. That is not a small thing. That is, in many ways, the most important thing a soldier can offer the people around them. The policy change came in 2013. Then, fully, in 2015, the ban on women in direct combat roles was lifted. The positions were opened. The standards where they existed remained in place, not adjusted, not altered, not made easier. And women who wanted to try for the Ranger program, the Special Forces, the Marine Corps Infantry could try. Some did. Some passed. Some did not. The standards held. She had been doing the job without the title for more than a decade by then. The policy catching up to reality was, for her, less a triumph than a correction. Like watching someone finally fix a leak that had been dripping for years. You were glad it was fixed. You were also aware that a lot of water had already come through the ceiling. The women who came after her, the ones who went through Ranger School, who earned the tabs and the scrolls, who stood at graduation ceremonies and received recognition that she and the women who had fought beside her in Iraq and Afghanistan had never been offered. Those women are the real measure of what the policy change meant. They had a path, a formal path, an institutional path. They did not have to prove through a firefight in an undesignated combat role that they were capable of what everyone who had been paying attention already knew they were capable of. She was glad for them. She was glad in the same way that anyone who has done something the hard way is glad when the people who come after have it easier. Not resentfully, not with the sour quality of someone who thinks their sacrifice is being discounted, but genuinely with the understanding that the difficulty she had gone through had been partly in service of making the path clear for someone else. That is, in fact, what service means. At the root of it, she stayed in the Army. She made Master Sergeant. She trained soldiers. She deployed again to Afghanistan in the later years of that war, when it had passed through its phases of escalation and de-escalation and arrived at the particular exhaustion that long wars develop. The exhaustion of a conflict that everyone knows will not end in the way it was supposed to end, but that nobody has quite figured out how to end any other way. She did the work that needed doing. She came home. Her record, by the time she eventually stepped back from active service, was not the record of someone who had done one remarkable thing and then coasted on its shadow. It was the record of someone who had done one remarkable thing and then kept doing remarkable things and never mentioned the first one unless someone specifically asked. Most people specifically asked. She answered the same way every time. The convoy, the radio, the road, the shots, the trench, what she did and how she did it, told with the same economy she brought to everything. No dramatización, no misaligi. Just the facts in the order they happened, reported accurately, with the occasional technical detail that reminded the listener this was not a movie, but a military action that had specific tactical elements and specific outcomes that could be explained and analyzed and learned from. She wanted it learned from. That was ultimately why she was willing to keep talking about it. Not for the recognition, not for the narrative, but because the things that happened on that road had information in them that could keep future soldiers alive if future soldiers absorbed it. The way she moved, the decision to dismount, the flanking route, the close quarters engagement in the trench. Every choice she had made was a data point, and data points save lives when they are properly studied and applied. She was not sentimental about the past. She was practical about it. The war in Iraq officially ended, and then sort of unofficially continued, and then ended again in a different way, and continued in yet another way, the way wars in that part of the world had been doing since before her parents were born. She watched it from home, and from bases, and from the particular vantage point of someone who had been inside the machinery and understood its gears better than any news report could convey. She watched without illusion. She had lost some things in that war that she did not name in interviews. She had carried things back from it that did not show up in the official record. Every soldier carries those things. The ones who say otherwise are either lying or haven't been paying attention to themselves. She was paying attention. She was always paying attention. The Silver Star sat in a display case in her home. It was not the first thing you noticed when you walked in. It was not lit with a spotlight or positioned in the center of the room. It was where she put it, which was where it belonged, present, visible if you looked for it, but not the organizing principle of the space. She was the organizing principle of the space. There were other things in that house. Photographs of the people she had served with. A few objects that had come back with her from the deployments that meant something she did not explain to visitors, but that she could hold and feel the specific gravity of the weight of what they represented. The ordinary objects of an ordinary life. Dishes, books, the furniture that accumulates when a person stays in one place long enough to need it. The stuff of being alive and in the world and continuing after the thing that could have stopped you did not stop you. She kept going. That is, in the end, the summary of her life after March 20th, 2005, and also the summary of March 20th, 2005 itself. She kept going when going meant something that most people will never be asked to do. She kept going when the keeping was the entire act of courage, not the dramatic charge, but the decision to continue moving when everything was saying stop. She kept going after two. The reports that came out of Salman Pak that day, the formal after-action reports, the intelligence assessments, the casualty documentation, told the story in the Army's language. Numbers, positions, times, outcomes. They were accurate. They were also, in the way that all official documents are, a blueprint of a house that you have to live in to actually understand. The people who had been in the convoy understood it the way you understand something you've lived in. They knew which wall was thin. They knew which door stuck. They knew exactly how it sounded and smelled and felt from the inside, and they carried that knowledge in a part of themselves that did not have a form to fill out or a box to check. Lee and Hester carried it quietly. She continued to carry it. In 2015, when the combat ban was fully lifted, when the newspapers ran the headlines about the new era of the American military, and the reporters found the old photographs and wrote the sentences about how far the institution had come, her name appeared again. The first woman, the Silver Star, the trench in Iraq, the before picture in a before and after story that the country liked telling about itself. She gave the same interview she always gave. Accurate, unembellished, complete. She said she was glad for the women who came after. She said the standards were the standards, and that was right and proper. She said the measure of a soldier was not the role they were assigned, but what they did when the role and the reality separated, when the job description and the actual job became two different things, and you had to decide in real time without consultation which one you're going to honor. She said she had honored the actual job. She had. There's a kind of heroism that announces itself. It arrives with the soundtrack and the slow motion and the full awareness of its own significance. It knows it is heroic. It performs the heroism for the camera and the record. And then there's the other kind. The kind that does not know, in the moment, that it is anything other than necessary. The kind that has no interior monologue about its own significance. The kind that moves because moving is what the situation requires, and then comes home and goes back to work and tells the story when asked and puts the medal in a case and keeps living. Lee and Hester was the second kind. The Rangers were pinned on a ridge. The radio was transmitting. The calculation was running a command. 18 minutes, available units, extraction windows. The road southeast of Baghdad looked like every other road until it didn't. And a sergeant from Bowling Green, Kentucky, was in a support vehicle with a rifle and a decision to make. She made it. She went. She cleared the trench. She brought them home. That is the whole story. All the words that came after it. The ceremonies, the policy debates, the interviews, the headlines, the history books, and training manuals that will carry her name for decades. Those are the world's accounting of it. The story itself is 20 minutes in a trench and a woman who kept moving. The rest is commentary. The rest will last a long time. But the 20 minutes were first, and the 20 minutes are the thing that everything else points back to. The moment before the first shot, when the road was just a road, and she was just a soldier on a convoy running a mission she had run before. The moment after, when the trench was quiet and the dust was settling and she was checking to make sure her people were still breathing. They were. She made sure of it. That's what she did. That is who she was. That is, in the most complete sense of the phrase, the whole truth. Sergeant Lee and Hester. Military Police. 617th MP Company. Kentucky Army National Guard. The first woman since World War II to receive the Silver Star for direct combat action. The last person who needed the record to say so to know it was true.